Well, thank you, Shabir. And I think the debate so far is an excellent demonstration of the different methods of interpreting Islam. On the one hand, we have the traditional Islamic method of interpreting the Quran, and we have the new Western method of interpreting the Quran. The traditional method of interpreting the Quran is based on the idea that Allah means what He says. Allah tells you what to believe. You don't tell Allah what He actually means. The Western method of interpreting the Quran is based on going through the Quran, finding passages that somehow agree or can be interpreted to agree with Western values, and then using those to reinterpret all of the passages that call for violence or subjugation. Now, Shabir brings up his criteria. He says that the Quran presents biblical figures as peaceful figures. Well, the more peaceful the Quran presents biblical figures, the worse the contrast between them and Muhammad. Because as we've seen, Muhammad eventually called for the violent subjugation of unbelievers for being unbelievers. He asks, does the Quran have a direct command about peace and violence? Yes, the Quran has commands about peace and violence. But as I pointed out, those commands depend on the status of Muslims in a society. And the violent passages come about when Muslims are in a position to dominate unbelievers. He says, do these commands fall into a just war theory? No. Fighting unbelievers, specifically for being unbelievers, based on their beliefs as Jew or Christian, does not fall into just war theory. Shabir says that I've picked verses that have an intended, a desired emotional impact, that I'm picking out very bad verses of the Quran. Actually, I quoted peaceful and violent Quran verses to show the different roles that these verses play based on the status of Muslims in a society. So I drew attention to peaceful verses of the Quran which apply in those kinds of situations. When I quote the violent passages, that's because those are the final marching orders of the Quran. There's nothing absurd if we're asking whether the Quran is a book of peace to ask what are the final marching orders? What is its final message about what people are supposed to do? And that's very important. If the Quran for 1,000 pages called for nothing but peace and tolerance, and on the last page said, by the way, fight everyone who disagrees with you, that wouldn't be a book of peace, right? Those are the final marching orders. And so when we look at the final marching orders of the Quran, and chapter 9 was the last major surah of the Quran revealed, and what do we find when we look at the last major surah of the Quran revealed? Fight those who do not believe in Allah, fight those of the unbelievers who are near to you, and let them find in you hardness. O Prophet, strive hard against the unbelievers and the hypocrites and be unyielding to them. If you want to reinterpret those, you have to say Allah is just not very clear. But Allah repeatedly says He's clear. So you have to pick one, but you can't have both Allah claiming to be clear and these verses meaning something radically different from what they're saying. Shabir says that we need criteria for distinguishing between authentic and non-authentic Muslim traditions. And if you recall what I did, almost every passage I quoted was from the Quran, wasn't it? Because that's a topic. The only time I quoted non-Quranic sources was when I quoted what the Quran says. I pointed out what it obviously means, and then I quoted Islam's most trusted commentator on the Quran to show that he agrees with my interpretation of the Quran. So I didn't just quote them and he's saying something that totally contradicts the Quran. I quoted the Quran, showed what the Quran says, and then I quoted Ibn Kathir as support. Say this, he agrees that it means exactly what I'm saying it means, just to show that I'm not just inventing my interpretations as I go along. So I didn't quote many sources outside of the Quran. I believe I quoted Ibn Kathir twice. I don't remember if I quoted anything else. But if Shabir wants to distinguish true sources from non-authentic sources, well, Muslims have methods for doing that, right? They have hadith criticism. But when we apply the methods of hadith criticism to distinguish true sayings of Muhammad from unreliable sayings of Muhammad, this doesn't help. These criteria do not help because you end up with passages which are deemed authentic by Muslim scholars, by hadith scholars, and you end up with passages like Muhammad saying in Sahih al-Bukhari 69:24, I've been commanded to fight people until they say La ilaha illallah. I've been commanded to fight people until they become Muslims. Now, here again, if you want to interpret that in some other way, which by the way lines up perfectly with what the Quran says, fight those who do not believe in Allah, what are you going to do? How do you reinterpret that? Let me put it this way. If Allah says, fight those who do not believe in Allah, when he really means fight in self-defense, and Muhammad says, I've been commanded to fight against people till they say there's no God but Allah, and he actually means fight people in self-defense, these are not very good communicators we're dealing with. These are disturbingly bad communicators. And I just have to point out that it seems like I have more respect for the clarity of Allah's statements and of Muhammad's statements than many Muslims. Another passage, Sahih al-Bukhari 2797, that is authentic by Muslim criteria of hadith. And here, don't take these as independent, just with what the Quran, going along with what the Quran says to show that Muhammad agrees with my interpretation. Sahih al-Bukhari 2797, Muhammad says, by him in whose hand my soul is, I would love to be martyred in Allah's cause, and then come back to life, and then get martyred, and then come back to life again, and then get martyred, and then come back to life again, and then get martyred. Shabir can throw out this passage all he wants, but my point is, when Allah says that you have to unquestioningly obey him, and then he says his commands are perfectly clear, and then he tells you, fight those who do not believe in Allah. How am I supposed to interpret that? I interpret it as, okay, if I'm in a situation, so this wouldn't apply to Muslims in the West, but if I'm in a situation where Muslims are the strongest force, then I have to violently subjugate unbelievers. And that's how Muhammad interprets it. That's how Islam's greatest interpreters of all time interpreted it. So who are we in the 21st century to say, no, that's not what Allah meant, even though he says he's perfectly clear. Muhammad, he didn't understand what Allah really meant, even though, according to Islam, Muhammad is the greatest interpreter of the Quran, and Islam's greatest scholars of all time got this wrong. If that's the method, we can interpret anything to mean anything we want. Now, Shabir says that Muhammad had different obligations when he became a leader. I know, that's exactly my point. When he became a leader, the methods entirely changed, and that's when you get the revelations, fight those who do not believe in Allah. So if that's Muhammad's job, when he gets in a position of leadership, why are any other Muslims around the world wrong when they get in a position of leadership and authority to subjugate unbelievers? That's what Muhammad said he was supposed to do in that situation. Now, Shabir makes a couple of interesting claims. He says that the abrogation verses in the Quran refer to the abrogation of previous scriptures, not to certain verses of the Quran abrogating other verses of the Quran. But this interpretation, I would say, is impossible if we have any consideration for what Muhammad's companions and others said about them. He cites John Burton, 20th century British Orientalist, to defend his claim. If I'm trying to discover what an Islamic doctrine means, I prefer going with actual Islamic scholars, not 20th century British revisionists. So let's look at the passages. Chapter 16, verse 101 of the Quran, Allah says, and when we change one communication for another communication, and Allah knows best what he reveals, they say, you're only a forger. Nay, most of them do not know. So, Muhammad's being accused of being a forger for changing something. And Shabir says, well, that's because he's changing the revelation. First of all, that would be impossible. I mean, these are the pagans of Mecca who are accusing him of being a forger. If it's for changing something in previous revelation, they didn't know enough about the Torah and the Gospel to accuse Muhammad of forgery for contradicting something in the Torah and the Gospel. But apart from that, we know the historical context here. This is Al-Wahidi. He actually gives the historical background. This verse was revealed when the idolaters said, Muhammad is mocking his companions. One day he commands them to do something, and the next day he forbids them from doing it, or brings instead something which is easier. He is nothing but a forger who says things of his own invention. So the historical background is, the polytheists are accusing Muhammad of changing his revelations. And we find the same thing with Surah 2, verse 106. When whatever communications we abrogate or cause to be forgotten, we bring one better than it or like it. The commentary, according to Muhammad's cousin, Ibn Abbas, I would assume that he has an idea of what it meant. Ibn Abbas says, then Allah mentions what was abrogated of the Quran and that which was not abrogated as a direct reference to the claim of the Quraysh, Muhammad's tribe, who said to the Prophet, O Muhammad, why do you command us to do something and then forbid it? So if we look at the verses sound like they're saying something about Muhammad changing his revelations. We look at the commentaries tell us exactly. Muhammad's companions tell us what. And by the way, since Shabir wants to distinguish authentic from non-authentic traditions, you can go to Islam's most trusted sources. In Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, they're filled with passages about one verse of the Quran abrogating another verse. So wherever we go, we come down on the side of Quran verses abrogating other Quran verses. And why would we ever go against it? Because John Burton says so? Interesting. Shabir made an argument that the word silm means Islam. And let's go ahead and read the verse, chapter 2, verse 208. O you who believe, enter completely into Islam, and do not follow the footsteps of Satan. Surely he is your open enemy. Let me give some translations here. Shabir says this should read, enter completely into peace. Well, let's go through some translations. Pickthall, come all of you into submission. Yusuf Ali, enter into Islam wholeheartedly. Hilali Khan, enter perfectly in Islam. Shakir, enter into submission, one and all. Sher Ali, come to submission, all of you. Khalifa, you shall embrace total submission. They're translating it as Islam and submission. Why would they do that? Well, we know what the historical background of this verse is. A Jew converted to Islam. His name was Abdullah ibn Salam. He converted to Islam, but he still kept Jewish dietary restrictions and the Jewish Sabbath. And this was reported to Muhammad that this Jewish convert was continuing to keep the Jewish rituals. And this verse was revealed as a response, enter completely into Islam. Notice, enter completely into peace would make no sense. The guy's not accused of being violent. He's accused of not entering completely into Islam, still maintaining Jewish practices. So the historical context shows that this actually means what it says, enter completely into Islam or into submission. But now, that's what Shabir was basing his reinterpretation of the Quran on, that this says enter completely into peace, so the Quran must be very peaceful. Well, it doesn't mean that, and so we're left with verses of the Quran abrogating other verses. We know that's the historical context. So verses of the Quran abrogate other verses. Well, that means the peaceful verses, which come earlier in the life of Muhammad, are abrogated or canceled by the final marching orders, which call for violently subjugating unbelievers. So is the Quran a book of peace? I'd say no.